My object this morning is to impress on you the importance right now, today, of the subject of energy and the tremendous opportunity that's before us to get it right. And if we get it right, it can make a big difference. But history shows that we don't necessarily get it right. So I'm going to start by putting this into historic context, and then talk about today and some of the things that we're doing here at Stanford and elsewhere, and how we are trying to help our country take advantage of the moment. At the end of World War II, or as it was drawing to an end, some very creative people in the Truman administration and carried over into the Eisenhower administration took some actions that made a gigantic difference. They looked back, and what did they see? They saw two world wars. The first one settled on a vindictive basis. The second one, 70 million people, military and civilian, were killed. They saw the Great Depression. They saw the protectionism that accompanied it. They saw that the protectionism was one of the ingredients, not mainly the main one, but one of the ingredients that led to the Second World War. So I saw the interaction between economics and the desire for control of energy resources and the war. They saw the Holocaust. So they saw in the past a horrible period. And they said, we've got to do better. And they did. They set out the concept of containment of the aggressive Soviet intentions, implemented with NATO. They created the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, now the World Bank, the IMF, other things, worked on the economic side. And in the process, they managed to construct a global economic and security commons. And everybody benefited from it. Now, enter the energy picture. In 1969, I was Secretary of Labor on leave from the University of Chicago. And I got a letter from the president of the university, Ed Levy. And the letter said, "Dear George, I see you reformed the Job Corps." That was a controversial thing I did. "And now you're taking on the oil import program. How would you like to teach next fall? Because obviously, if you get tangled up with these things, you're out." I was appointed chairman of a cabinet committee on the oil import program. At that time, we had a quota of 20%. President Eisenhower had thought that if we imported more than 20% of the oil we used, we were asking for trouble in national security terms. So my task force, which included the Secretary of State, Defense, Treasury, everybody, you can see, highly important. Recently, I reviewed some of our work. And in 1970, we made a report. We said that we should have a program that limits our imports from the Middle East area to no more than 10% of the total, that we should emphasize a relationship with Canada, that we should look for alternatives, that we should develop storage facilities, and so on. Our report didn't get implemented, except in some general ways. So in 1973, by that time I'm Secretary of the Treasury, there is no energy department. On comes the Arab oil boycott. The United States had undertaken to re-equip the Israelis in the Yom Kippur War, and the boycott was designed to cause us to change our policies. It was designed in a way to divide us from our allies. The British and the French denied access of our airplanes, their airports, on our way to help the Israelis. So they were not subjected to the boycott at all. Oil kept flowing to them. As I said, there was no energy department, so the Treasury inherits that. So I worked with it. People came in and told me about their ideas for alternatives. And I could see that there were some ideas there, but no real content. Our economy exploded. It even touched some of our culture as people were urged not to use Christmas lights. The president asked gas stations not to sell gas on Saturday afternoon and Sundays, keep people from driving on the weekends, and so on. And I reflected on this and I said, you know, President Eisenhower had a point. Big point. Then the boycott stopped and the price of oil went back down. And to my disappointment, all of the effort that seemed to get started in looking for alternatives stopped. No support, no interest at all, stopped. I've seen that happen since then. When the Iranian Revolution took place in 1979, went through the same roller coaster. So when there's something of a crisis in the oil market, interest starts in doing something by way of research on energy. And as soon as things go back, it stops. So that's our problem. Because today, what's happening is that the economic and security commons that I referred to is falling apart for a variety of reasons. And it's important to try to put it back together again, just as it's important to do something about our energy side. And the opportunity today is of such importance and magnitude and energy that it can be one of the key ingredients in rebuilding the commons that everybody benefited from. So what are the opportunities? They're twofold. First, let me back up. What's the problem? The problems are threefold. First is national security. It isn't only access to energy. It's special kind of energy. It's more and more obvious to us in military terms and in civilian terms how important it is to have the ability to create energy nearer where you use it. Long supply lines for the military are devastating. And overdependence on a grid subjects our civilian economy to peril. So we have to have some things to learn, importantly in national security. And of course, from the standpoint of our economy, reliable, inexpensive energy is a fundamental ingredient. And now we have emerged over the last 30 or 40 years, it's gradually come into people's minds, the importance of the environment. Sally mentioned I was the first director of the Office of Management and Budget. And what happens when a new agency is created in the federal government is they get people and physical plant and budget and so forth from existing agencies, and that's how they get started. But they don't have any advocates, so if you're not careful, they get all the dregs. So the OMB becomes their advocate. And we're pretty good advocates because we know where the bodies are buried and nobody wants to mess with us. So when I became director of the budget, President Nixon had just signed the legislation that created the Environmental Protection Agency. So we helped put it together way back there in 1970. So there's been a long time consciousness of environmental concerns. But added to that now is the realization that our planet is warming very clearly, and the consequences of it are going to be not very good. Of course, if you live in Siberia, maybe you'll think it's a good thing. But there is a new ocean being created in the Arctic region. And that suddenly has underlined border disputes, questions about what's navigable, who owns it, whether it's a Canadian, whether the Northwest Passage is a Canadian river or an international waterway, and so on. Vast natural resources available. So there's no question that the globe is warming. The late Pat Moynihan, Senator Moynihan, was a great friend of mine. He had a great phrase. He said, "You are entitled to your opinion, but you are not entitled to your facts." So somebody who says the globe is not warming, I'm sorry to say, they're not entitled to their facts. That's not a fact. The fact is the other way. It's not an idea or a theory. It's a fact. You can observe it. So we have this trilogy of problems to address. And what is the nature of the new opportunity? The twofold. The first is the emergence of a technology that's a derivative of horizontal drilling. Horizontal drilling has been around quite a while. But now, as you know, you can drill down and then you can drill horizontally for quite a distance, maybe even further than down. And what that does is it gives you a way of penetrating shale and other formations and opening up the seams so that you can get oil and gas out of it that you couldn't get before because you don't drill down into a pool of some kind. This is a different source. But with American ingenuity, they have figured out how to do that, and with high pressure, water and slum chemicals, to open up oil and gas reserves that were unavailable before. This has suddenly revolutionized the availability of natural gas in the United States. And we see in North Dakota and South Texas, the same thing is happening in tight oil. So for the first time in 3 decades, the amount of crude being produced in the U.S. has been going up. Now, there are problems with this technology. And it's important in taking advantage of the technology that we be realistic and clear about the problems and understand them well, and understand how to cope with these issues, as in the escape of methane gas or groundwater problems. As I understand it, that's probably the most difficult. But at any rate, it's been important to recognize those and deal with them. The Department of Energy has worked at it. we had in our Hoover task force that Sally mentioned, we had a meeting on the fracking technology with people employing it and people from the Environmental Defense Fund. It's an outstanding environmental organization. And they have been making a big effort to understand the problems, figure out what's to be done about them, and try to figure out how to put into place a regulatory framework that can work. So that's opportunity number one. And it can change the geopolitics of energy. It isn't only the United States, obviously, where this technology is applicable. I was in China a few months ago, and our little group had a meeting with a man who will become the premier of China in another month or so. And we had a lengthy meeting with him, and I brought up this technology, and I was astonished at how much he knew about it right off the bat like that. And he told me all the different places in China where he thought it could be applicable. And then he said something that I really found comforting. He said, you know, we have to be careful we use this technology in such a way that we don't have some big environmental catastrophe that sets it back. So I was impressed that he was alert to that and saw how there is a kind of global need to do it right. So that's one thing. The second thing is of at least as much importance, and in the long run, more important. And that is that for the first time in this roller coaster that I've described to you, for the first time really, we have a fairly large number of first-class scientists and engineers working on this subject. And they are funded, it could be more adequately funded, but they've been funded reasonably in recent years from both private and public sources. I think it's important that that's the way it is. Private sources are people who are in the business of energy in one way or another, usually, which means that if something is developed that clearly works and is scalable, they're the ones who know how to commercialize it and scale it up. So at any rate, this work is going forward. I'm most familiar with the work going on here at Stanford, which is very wide in what it's doing and very impressive, and with work going on at MIT. MIT also has a big program, and they have an advisory board that they asked me to chair, so I get to see both. So work is really going on strongly. Solar panels now are basically practically competitive with electricity from the grid. And you talk to the people working on it, and they're full of ideas about what they call efficiency. In other words, they get the cost down. I'm always struck in talking to them by the fact that over half the cost today is the cost of installation. In other words, pick and shovel work. So I keep saying, and I think people are working, how do we design our solar panels or solar installations so they're easier to install? Because obviously that's where a big cost. Then, of course, people worry about the intermittency of energy derived from the sun or the wind. So it's impressive to me to listen to people who are working on larger scale storage. And if that can be worked out, you can see how it takes away the intermittency problem. It also deals to a certain extent with the need to create energy where you use it. You can store it. And of course, solar is produced where the sun shines. Then you have batteries in cars that are light years better than what they were, say, 10 or 15 years ago. I drove the EV1 around. That was the General Motors electric car 15 years or so ago. It was a great little car, drive around. But half the weight, at least, was battery, gigantic battery. But I enjoyed it. I was sorry when GM stopped. I told them, you have to get started. And they did, but then they didn't keep going. But now there are more electric cars available. My home is here on the Stanford campus, and I have solar panels on the roof. I've long since paid for them by the amount of cost of my electricity that I've saved. And I drive an all-electric car. So I'm driving on sunshine. There's plenty of it. And it's free. It's free. It doesn't cost me anything. So these things are coming. An electric car is just off the shelf. I mean, the chassis could be any chassis. My guess is that they're going to be using composite materials and make them lighter over time, so you don't have as much drag. And the electric motor has been around a long time. It's very efficient. As the battery gets more efficient, the electric car will become a more and more prominent part, I believe. Biofuels, I think that we will see a breakthrough in the next year or two. I'm fairly confident in the ability to extract the sugary material from cellulosic stuff. There's been a huge recalcitrance problem there. What was going to happen in nuclear power remains to be seen. I think the most promising thing going on, and I'm not equipped to appraise it well, but people here like Bert Richter, who is, seem to be optimistic that small-scale nuclear power plants may become more available. And of course, smaller scale means you don't have a huge thing with big grid out of it. You can have something smaller that serves a smaller area. I might say natural gas plants have the same possibility. They can be built in various sizes and be economic, so you can produce power where you're using it. So I have all of these things that are on the radar scope. We have done something here that I hope will turn out well. About a little over a year ago, we got a group of scientists from MIT and a similar number that Sally and others helped organize from Stanford. And we had them a big meeting over at the Hoover. And we said, let's talk about game changers in these various areas. And we made quite a lot of headway. Then we had a sort of a return meeting. We all went to MIT and did the same thing, and we hope to get a little report out of that that says, here are some things that R&D has accomplished. They're now being used. Here are things that are on the cusp, and people are working on them, and it's practically certain they're going to get somewhere. It's just a few problems need to be resolved. And here are some things that are further back but are beginning to shape up, being conceptualized in a reasonable way, and in the long run will have a big impact. And if we can learn how, and we hope to take that to Washington and talk to the powers that be and explain to them why it's important to maintain and sustain support for energy R&D. And I'm optimistic that we're going to get somewhere in that regard. And then there are a number of public policy type issues that we've been working on over at Hoover. There's the idea of a flex fuel vehicle. In other words, you take the internal combustion engine and you can change it in a way that doesn't cost very much. And you make it more receptive to fuels other than gasoline so that it's more competitive. And my own feeling is that we need to put a price on carbon so that various forms of energy bear their full cost. The pollution that you produce with a form of energy is not included in your cost, but society pays it. So we need to have a way of doing that. And I have been advocating, and gradually we're beginning to get somewhere, a revenue-neutral carbon tax. So if you make it revenue-neutral, the tax mafia can't say it's a tax because it doesn't wind up collecting any money. So we may be able to get something like that through. At any rate, I think, to go back to my original theme, that this is a moment when there are really big-time possibilities available. And I particularly emphasize the importance of the research and development in the field of energy that can give us 5 or 10 years from now a very different picture, and one that's much more compatible with our security concerns, our economic concerns, and our environmental concerns. So I'm looking out at you who are going to become part of this enterprise here at Stanford and say, good luck, and work hard, and produce a lot of good stuff that I can describe to people in the next year or two. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have a time for 1 or 2 questions. So, is anyone have a question? Yeah, don't be shy. Yeah, okay, back there. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Shultz, for being here and taking the time to speak with us. In one of your recent book chapters with Dr. Taylor, you talked about how work attaches people to reality. Could you elaborate maybe on one of the most critical life experiences where you came to realize that, where everything started making sense in kind of a global context, of what you're doing really matters, and how that translates to us as we begin our graduate studies?
The changes taking place that have disrupted the commons I spoke about are quite a few, but 2 prominent are changes in demography and the information and communication revolution. I won't describe all of it, but in the Middle East, in Africa, the Maghreb, fertility has come down a little, but not a huge amount. So those are very young societies. And they have so organized themselves somehow that the young people, to a very considerable extent, have nothing to do. They stand around. And now with the information and communication revolution, anybody can find out more or less what's going on. And they can organize because they can communicate. They have cell phones. They have all this stuff. So there is a toxic mix, and we see what people are calling the Arab Spring. I call it the Arab Awakening. But it spreads across the world. And we see people protesting. And my own feeling is that whatever regime brings stability to those places will have to be a regime that provides people with opportunities for work. Because, as you were quoting me, work attaches you to reality. Work gives you some dignity because you get something and you feel you deserve it. You earned it. So I think something like that is very healthy. But this volatility is once again underlining the importance of not being dependent on what comes out of the Middle East. I'm not saying we can't use their product, but if you get yourself in a position where you're dependent, and whether it's an Arab boycott or not, if it's something happens that blows up the facilities, you don't want to wind up behind the 8 ball for that reason. So it's only another way of underlying the importance of the new technology, but also of figuring out by our scientists and engineers how we produce energy in different ways that are closer to home.
Okay, one more quick question. No? Okay, we've got one over here. Yes.
Sorry. Do you see any path in sort of domestic politics here in the U.S. to bipartisan acceptance that climate change is a fact, or that something like a carbon tax is really required to move forward on energy policy?
Well, I'm an optimist about these things. I've spent a great deal of my life working in the federal government, and my experience is that if something is obviously the right thing to do, sooner or later it even dawns on people in Washington, and they wind up doing it. We've gotten to the point where, as I said, I don't see how anyone can argue that the globe is not warming. There are too many observable facts. So then the argument is why. And there's some conceptions that have been out there for quite a while about why. And they have produced projections that have turned out to be reasonably accurate. So you've got to say maybe there's something to them. And they have to do with the way we conduct ourselves. And I think that we have to say, even if there's an argument, shouldn't we be taking out an insurance policy? I was Secretary of State back in the 1980s when we could see that the ozone layer was depleting. And there were some arguments among the scientists. Most thought it was, and some were skeptical, and they were arguing. There was no argument, however, that if it were so and it happened, it would be a catastrophe, and it was not reversible. So I can remember going to President, we were managing this in the State Department with our EPA people, going to the President and saying, Mr. President, going to congressional leaders and saying, here's this problem, and there's some argument about it, but most think it's there. And they all agree on how tough it'll be if it happens. So don't you think we should take out an insurance policy and work on it? And he agreed. And we worked at it. We went to congressional leaders and we went through the same line of argument. And out of that came something called the Montreal Protocol, which we then brought to the Senate. It was ratified with no problems because I always felt if you want me in on the landing, include me in the takeoff. They were all included in the takeoff. We had a good break because out of the scientific engineering community with the DuPont company, they produced something that was relatively inexpensive that could deal with the problem. So once again, you had the interaction of need with the production of something that could work out of this ingenious thing that we seem to have here, and Stanford epitomizes it, of a productive interaction between the university community, the research community, and people who form companies and can take a great idea and do something with it. So that's my experience. And I think over time we'll get somewhere. I'm even encouraged by some things I've heard lately that maybe there's some real interest in the revenue-neutral carbon tax. And I also think politically the way to approach it right now is not with some big grand things, but to take some rifle shot things, revenue-neutral carbon tax, flex fuel vehicles, enough money for support R&D. And things like that, and we begin gradually to get something going. So I think we're going to get there, but the key, of course, is to be ready when the moment comes. And that's the reason why what's going on here at Stanford, at MIT, and I'm sure lots of other places that I'm not so familiar with, is of such importance. Because here people are developing the fundamental ideas that can be implemented. And when the moment comes when people say, okay, then we're there, we can deliver. So I say, never give up. Always be an optimist. If you're going to be in public policy issues, you've got to be an optimist, because the going is so rough that if you aren't basically optimistic, well, you'll stop. And you can't stop. You've got to keep going. And I've seen lots of things happen very positively.
Okay, well, with that, please join me in thanking Secretary Shultz.